Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Krylik. I am president of the Springfield Township Historical Society. Today is January 28th, 2021. Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome this evening to our 7th annual History in Motion event. It is the primary fundraising event for the Springfield Township Historical Society, and I appreciate your joining us this evening and supporting the Historical Society. What I would like to do first and foremost is thank not only you, but also the sponsors of this evening's program. And I should note that the sponsorships that you see are for the entire year of 2021, not just this event. We appreciate the sponsorship of those folks and companies that you see on your screen. Michael De Laurentiis for concrete work, BQ Basement Systems, Compass Real Estate, Krylik Conservation, Dan Helwig Inc. Realtors, Mara Restoration, Russell Roofing, Murray Funeral Home, and Coxey Too Good. So to those sponsors, thank you very much for your sponsorship. We really appreciate it. And throughout the year, you'll be seeing highlights, or I should say spotlights, for each of the sponsors to direct you to their websites should you need their services. And I know for a fact that all of these companies do terrific work in the restoration field. Myself, I have worked with all of them, and I appreciate their sponsorship of this event and throughout the year. So, and I should also acknowledge Roman and Littlefield Publishing Group, who has offered a significant discount of 30% off the list price for the book. If you haven't already ordered a book, sponsorship includes a book, which we've already ordered and they're on their way. But if you'd like to order a book, you can go on the Historical Society's website, springfieldhistory.org, and there's a link there to the book and the discount coupon code that you would use to get that 30% discount. So Roman and Littlefield has generously offered that. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention Seedling and Sage, the catering group at Flowertown Country Club. They also provided meals to sponsors and any others that were interested. For those of you that took advantage of it, I know that Cynthia and I did here. The salmon was terrific, and the tequila drink was quite nice. So hopefully you'll take advantage of those services as well. And for any meals that were purchased, the Springfield Township Historical Society gets 10% back on that as well. So again, what I'm going to do is introduce our speaker this evening, Nancy Moses, and then I'll turn the screen over to her, and we'll go ahead with our program. So Nancy Moses, her award-winning books and articles explore iconic cultural treasures and the provocative issues they raise. Her books include Fakes, Forgeries, and Frauds, Stolen, Smuggled, Sold, On the Hunt for Cultural Treasures, and Lost in the Museum, Buried Treasures and the Stories They Tell. She created the Philadelphia Business Journal's Power Lunch column and a television series about game-changing women. The former executive director of Philadelphia's History Museum, the Atwater Ken. Nancy's career features senior positions at the National Endowment for the Humanities, University of Pennsylvania's Fels School of Government, and WQED's Pittsburgh Public Broadcasting. A diverse portfolio of clients have achieved major gains as a result of her expertise in nonprofit planning and development. Nancy serves as chair of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, the state agency responsible for preserving, interpreting, and sharing Pennsylvania's historical assets. She holds a master's degree from George Washington University and was a visiting scholar at the American University of Rome. Her program this evening is on her latest book, Fakes, Forgeries, and Frauds.
Thank you, Scott. And I want to give a special thank to Bob Brock and my dear friend Coxie Toogood. It's very nice to be with you again. And I'm going to talk today about a topic that's close to your heart and my heart, historic preservation, but from a slightly different point of view. Because I'm going to talk about Nuremberg, Germany, and what's fake, what's real, and why do we care? I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about what sparked my interest in this topic. Then we're going to talk about Nuremberg from a historical preservation point of view and explore this real question: what's real, what's fake, and why do we care? I'd like you all to know two things. First of all, everything I'm showing you in Nuremberg comes from the Nuremberg archives. I spent 2 weeks there, a lot of it in the archives. And so a call out and thank you to the Nuremberg archive. Secondly, you can see most of everything I'm showing you if you go to Nuremberg, as I did. And I have to tell you that I'm Jewish, and doing this research was really complicated for me because I needed people to talk to me. And so I had to put my own values aside. So what are we talking about today? Fakes, frauds, and forgeries. And sometimes I'd like to remind myself what these words mean. So a fake is something new that mimics the original. A forgery is something that copies the original, and a fraud is stating something that's that is original and which isn't, and then getting caught up in the lie. And fraud is a legal term. You can go to jail for fraud. And I want to tell you that there are a lot of copies, as we know. Some are, replicas. We're going to see some replicas today of buildings, some reconstructions. Those aren't fake unless they're held out to be real. This is what got me interested in this topic altogether. Moses Shapiro was an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem when in 1893, he brought to his very most important clients, the British Museum, something wonderful: 15 fragments of goatskin inscribed with a Proto-Hebraic language, something that predated Hebrew. And if they were real, as he thought they were early copies of Deuteronomy, early versions of Deuteronomy, and that meant they would predate the Bible. They would call into question everything that had to do with biblical scholarship. Well, the British Museum got very excited, even when Moses Shapiro offered these for about £1 million, which today would be $156 million for these scraps of ancient goatskin. And they put them on display immediately, and they were published in newspapers. This is one that's called the Athenaeum, if you could read it. And people stood in long lines to see these politicians and celebrities and royals, and even a couple biblical scholars. And things were looking very good for Moses Shapiro until the biblical scholars started asking questions. Who was this Moses Shapiro anyway? He was clearly not a biblical scholar. How had he found them when all the biblical scholars didn't know anything about him? These pieces of parchment, they looked surprisingly fresh, as if Moses Shapiro had written on them the day before. And Shapiro had said he'd gotten them from the Bedouin who'd found them in the Dead Sea, in caves near the Dead Sea. Well, said the biblical scholars, those Bedouin had been going in and out of those caves for eons looking for guano, which was very valuable. Why didn't they ever bring out pieces of parchment? Why had they only come to light now? Well, it changed everything for Moses Shapiro. The British Museum decided they didn't want to buy these things. He said that he was caught up in shame. He'd never been so distraught in his life. And he left London. He left these parchments behind at the British Museum, sort of abandoned them, and was discovered 6 weeks later in Rotterdam in a hotel room, dead, and next to him was a suicide note. He'd committed suicide. Well, when I read about Moses Shapiro and what's called the Shapiro incident, I couldn't keep it out of my mind. I found it very provocative, and it raised all sorts of issues for me. How do we know what we know to be true? Who owns the truth? What does authenticity really mean? And I thought I'd search for the answers in my field of study, which is cultural treasures and the provocative issues they raise. So I set off to do that. I started researching a book about cultural treasures because I thought they would be very interesting. And I created a book that is structured as a series of true life crimes stories. And each is about a very different object and about someone who committed fraud or forgery. Each of them is a very different kind of story, and they all reveal something different about why we believe what we believe and what reality really is. So, for example, there is a story about a young man who lived in London in 1790, and he wrote a play in Shakespeare's handwriting and held it off as its own and duped everybody, including all of the experts on Shakespeare. And he was finally called out. And you can actually go and see the fake Shakespeare at the Rosenbach Library downtown. I decided to write a chapter about Rembrandt because there's a painting in the Frick Museum that the former director of the Frick told me was only 2/3 Rembrandt. Well, what does that mean? How can a painting be only 2/3 Rembrandt? And so I went to Amsterdam and talked to art collectors and went through every piece of paper and every document, of which there are voluminous numbers, about this painting, which is called the Polish Rider, to see if I could discover why it was only 2/3. And readers come along with me as we uncover the story, which is fun for me and I think fun for them. And frankly, after writing about stolen things that were stolen and things that were buried in the basement of museums but had great stories, I thought writing a book about fakes, frauds, and forgeries would be pretty easy because things are either real or they're fake, right? Well, it's not always that simple. I found things that may or may not be real. I found objects that were partially real. I even found objects that were real and then discredited and then turned real again. And each of them told me something different about the mutability of reality. Take Nuremberg, Germany as an example. On the left is a postcard I found. It's a print from that was on a postcard, and it's from 1830s, and it's tourists on the ramparts of the Imperial Castle in Nuremberg looking over the city. And what they're seeing there is a medieval city. On the other side is Nuremberg today, the Nuremberg that I saw when I stood at that exact same spot and looked over the city and saw what I thought was a medieval city. It had medieval buildings, it had medieval churches, it had these little winding medieval streets. It was very quaint. And I had no reason to think that it wasn't authentic. But then as I was standing there, looking over the city, I started remembering a little bit about World War II history. And I remembered that at the end of World War II in 1944 and 45, the Allies flew over Germany and essentially decimated those cities. They left them in ruin. And I thought, well, okay, by that time I'd been to Berlin, I'd been to Mainz, I'd been to Dresden, I'd been to Frankfurt, and I knew all of those cities had suffered major damage during World War II. What was it about Nuremberg that set that aside? Why hadn't it happened in Nuremberg? Well, as it turns out, as I learned later, it actually did happen in Nuremberg. 90% of the city was wiped out. Okay, so your next question is, if 90% of the city is wiped out and you're standing looking over the city, what are you seeing? Is it a fake city? Is it Disneyland brought to you by the city fathers of Nuremberg to fool tourists like me? Well, I had all of that in my mind. And when I was thinking about actually making this book, creating this book about fakes, frauds, and forgeries, I thought I'd do a chapter on historic preservation. And that's when I remembered Nuremberg. Now, because it was bombed and reconstructed, I knew it would be a really good place to explore the connection between historic preservation and authenticity. What I didn't realize, and later came to see, was that Nuremberg seemed to be much more complicated than that. It is a city of rock and stone and stucco and wood and glass, but it's also a city of dreams. And by that I mean that at various times during its history, some important and wealthy man saw in Nuremberg something that piqued his fantasy, and he recreated Nuremberg to reflect that fantasy, to reflect his dream. Now, Nuremberg's not the only city that was transformed by the dream, the fantasy of a wealthy man. It's happened in the United States too. Colonial Williamsburg, I'm sure some of you have been there. John Rockefeller was looking for a place in the 1920s to project his fantasy of patriotic America. He actually at one point considered Germantown because there are a lot of very important colonial buildings there, but he gave it up for a little village in Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg. At the time he visited there and saw something that he could only imagine, there were only 88 buildings. He bought up a number of them from the owners. He transported other colonial buildings from other little towns, bought them and put them here. And over time, the number of structures grew and grew and grew as Colonial Williamsburg, that he endowed, purchased more buildings and built replicas. So what you're seeing in Colonial Village, in Colonial Williamsburg, is a mix of the real and the fake, or the reconstructed, or the replica, depending on how you see it. And that the illusion that it's a patriotic vision of Rockefeller's is reinforced with colonial food and colonial people in colonial garbs and colonial crafts. You can get caught up in that fantasy, that illusion, very quickly, as I have done twice, even knowing its backstory. So what's the backstory on Nuremberg? Well, Colonial Williamsburg was a sleepy village. It is now a living heritage site. Nuremberg is a living city, but both mind their mythic path. Both were shaped by powerful people for specific intentions: national pride, propaganda, tourism. And in both, the cityscape combines the real and the replica to evoke what one might imagine is an imagined history. So when I was working on my book, I returned to Nuremberg to spend a couple weeks there, to time travel into its past, and to find remnants of all of its history in the city of today. And I wanted to understand how its residents reconciled some of its more terrible legacies with the city of the past and the present and what they hoped for the future. Now, Nuremberg has been re-envisioned 3 times, and all of them harken back to this, which is Nuremberg during its heyday, the late medieval period. It was a walled city, as you can see. There's a wall that circles the city, and red roofs houses with lots of windows in them, and winding streets that lead up to a castle, the Imperial Castle. And you can see even the ramparts where those tourists and I stood. And there are also churches that are named in this picture. Well, Nuremberg in this period was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. It had important craftsmen. You may have heard of the Meister singers. Well, those are local guild men from the trades who would have a singing competition every year, and that captured Wagner's interest. And Dürer, one of the most creative, Albert Dürer, artists of the period, lived in Nuremberg. His house is one of the things that survived in the city. But most importantly, Nuremberg was a royal city. It was a city of the First Reich, the first rule. Every emperor of the Holy Roman Empire came to Nuremberg from Charlemagne on to be anointed at the city. And that gave it a very special status as the most Germanic of all German communities of German cities. Now, this is way before Germany was a country. Germany only became a country in the middle of the 1800s. But these German principalities spoke more or less the same language, and they saw themselves, all of them, as sort of Germanic, and this is the most Germanic at all. So this myth of quintessential Germanism inspired its 19th century version when this painting was made, when it became the poetical birthplace of German Romanticism. It all started in 1792 when 2 university students on vacation were tromping through the Bavarian countryside, and they came across a perfectly preserved medieval village just waiting for them to come. "My amazement knows no bounds," wrote one of these young men to his parents. "There's not a single new building in it. One is completely transported into the olden times, always expecting an encounter with a knight or a monk or a burgher in an old-fashioned costume. What a romantic vision." But what they imagined as something out of a Grimm's fairy tale was actually pretty grim. It was tattered, it was run down, dirty streets, dilapidated houses, and privies out back. Why did this happen? Well, those guilds that I told you about earlier, they were very conservative. They held a sway over the city, and they refused to change their methods. And because of that, the city was left behind while other cities moved forward. Not Nuremberg, it pretty much stayed in place. And so by the 1800s, it looked pretty much like a medieval city, but fallen apart. Well, the fantasy of these 2 young men actually helped to transform the city because it captured the interest of the King of Bavaria, whose name was Ludwig I. He called Nuremberg the German Pompeii of the Middle Ages, right? Pompeii, frozen in time. And then he established the world's first office of historic preservation to keep it that way. He hired an architect, Karl Alexander Heidelhoff, who restored Gothic formations. He rebuilt the castle, and then he added, just because he could, some faux neo-Gothic touches. And within a couple of years, Nuremberg became a highlight on the Grand Tour, a must-see destination. Mark Twain came here and wrote about it. Henry James, Nathaniel Hawthorne actually wrote a poem about it. And they all came because they wanted to experience King Ludwig's Germanic romantic Nuremberg dream. The myth lived on. Between 1933 and the outbreak of World War II, Nuremberg became the epicenter, the mythic epicenter of the Nazi Party. This is Hitler reviewing troops as they're marching through the middle of Nuremberg. Hitler was enamored with Nuremberg because of its status as the city of the First Reich. He felt himself an emperor, and he was creating the Third Reich. So he wanted to bring his party for its annual celebration to the most Germanic of all towns in Germany. And every September, all of the Nazis came. Not only the soldiers, but individual party members in massive droves to celebrate Hitler and his cult. Hitler, he imagined himself as a master architect, and so he hired one of the best, Albert Spears, and the two of them collaborated on recreating Nuremberg as a medieval city. Well, the city had been living, it's been used, so they had to redo things. So what they did was they paid homeowners money to take down later facades and until they revealed their medieval facades. And not only did they do that, but they contacted businesses in some of the major thoroughfares, like the one you're looking at now, and asked them to create their facades with Nuremberg, with medieval touches and swastikas all over them. The mayor of Nuremberg was a Nazi, and he invested millions in restoring 400 buildings. But it was a really good investment because before the war and even during the war, Germans came to Nuremberg as tourists. Well, over time, the crowds grew bigger and bigger, and Hitler and Spears had to find another place to put all of these Nazis for the 1 week in September that they came to celebrate their party. Now, near the city, about maybe 10 miles, 5-10 miles from the center of the old city, was a pleasure park. It was 4.5 miles square. And that's where they decided to build something called the Rally Ground to accommodate all of the people who would come. This place, the Rally Ground, became a dramatic setting for mass celebrations, solemn commemorations, and displays of force like the one you're seeing here. It was only used 1 year a week, which is stunning given the massive scale of money and manpower. It was largely built with slave labor, and it was designed to accommodate as many as 350,000 party faithful and inspire them to the service of the Nazi cult. This was Spears' genius. Architecture as propaganda, and here's a very good example. This is called the Zeppelin Field, and behind it is the grandstand called the Zeppelin Tribunal. The Zeppelin Tribunal, as you can see, is a series of giant pillars. It looks like a Roman pillars, and in the center atop the center is a gigantic Nazi insignia. And Hitler would come here a couple times during that week-long period to review the troops, as you can see them marching on. And the grandstands filled with military and their families. The rally grounds, as I said, was only used once a month and once a year. And Speer's vision, which he has this big plan with that you can see the plans at the rally grounds, was never fully realized, but its colossal buildings and vast landscapes make the rally grounds by far the largest ensemble of Nazi architecture still in existence. Now, Nazi Nuremberg only lasted for 6 years. The Third Reich is long gone. It ended when, in 1938, when Germany was planning on invading Poland the next year and needed the manpower to get ready for the invasion. So it only lasted 6 years, and the Reich is long gone, but the potency of that Nazi dream lives on. As those of us who watched the invasion of the US Capitol recently, we really know that. This is a Nuremberg that you could visit before 1945. This is what it looked like in January of 1945. Oh, in January of 1945. The other picture is from 1944 on. This is not January of 1945. And what you're seeing here is the city destroyed. On January 2nd of that year, Royal Air Force bombers decimated the city. They dumped 2,300 tons of explosives on this small walled city. In less than 1 hour, 92% of it was demolished, and it was a ghost town. 900 years of history and architecture wiped out in a single moment. Nuremberg's annihilation was only exceeded by Dresden, which happened a couple of days later, and both acts of destruction were part of the Allied strategy of saturation bombing. You target cities, you destroy industry and houses, you demoralize the residents, and you force unconditional surrender. So when you see the pictures of Nuremberg or even Dresden after during this time, you say to yourself, what accounts for such excess? And in Nuremberg's case, there are a couple reasons. One is that the Germans were also annihilating cities with living residents in them. We all know about the London Blitz as an example. So the Germans weren't the only people that started the war doing this. But there's two other things that make Nuremberg special. First of all, the year before, in 1944, the RAF had come to bomb Nuremberg, but the Germans had defeated them and taken down 92 airplanes. Over 550 people were killed. British were killed. Well, the same British bombing commander, Arthur Harris, was in charge of this raid. And one can say that he destroyed the city in part for retribution. But of course, there was another reason. Nuremberg was a spiritual center of the epicenter of the Nazi Party, so it had a certain additional spiritual resonance. And that symbolism certainly wasn't lost on the Allies, who in 1945 decided to hold the Nuremberg trials in Nuremberg, the trials of the most senior surviving officials of the Nazi Party. Among them was Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, who had medievalized Nuremberg and built the rally grounds. While most of the city was in rubble outside the old city, this part remained intact. This is called the Palace of Justice, and adjacent to it was a prison that survived the war, and a hotel where officials and the media could stay. And on your right, you see the actual trial where these are judges and defendants, and you can go into that courtroom. It's quite eerie. And this is what Nuremberg looked like during the trials. What you see is the destroyed city still in rubble, and Russian, Soviet, and British and US officials and a couple judges. Now, this is the late 1940s, and the trials went on for quite a while. But even in 1950, Nuremberg, like all German cities, were trying to figure out what to do with their city, what kind of city they wanted to become. And there were a couple of different models still already underway. Frankfurt is a good example. It decided to tear down all of the remaining buildings that were ruins, basically, and change its streetscape and build these sleek, wide avenues and roads for motor vehicles, and then a lot of modern buildings. So in Frankfurt, they're only just starting to bring back some of the original buildings that are gone, so they have to create them from zero, build replicas, which is what happened in Mainz. Mainz decided that what they were going to do is recreate their city, so they basically built replicas. Dresden, as you might remember, was in the East Germany. And so what the East Germans did was they built back a couple of the major buildings, a palace, fabulous church, and most of the rest of the city still is this sort of Soviet brutalistic architecture. Well, Nuremberg's solution was more nuanced, and some say that it was because of the process that shaped it. The city invited architects to present plans to the city fathers and the residents. And then at community meetings all over the city, and then everybody argued over the plans until they reached a compromise, more or less. And the plan is actually a compromise between Nuremberg's historical character and its need for new development. So here are the elements of the Nuremberg plan. First, the city would restore its most historic buildings where some remnants remain. In front of you, you can see a kind of tower. That's a church tower. And that church was rebuilt. It's called Siebold. And it was actually possible to do that in Nuremberg, to restore some of the major buildings, including churches, because of what Nuremberg did at the beginning of the war. In 1940, the citizens thought, well, maybe we're going to be invaded. So what they did is they removed stained glass windows and architectural detail, statues and window treatments and so on. And they stored them in a secret cave underground and put in front of that cave a antique shop so that nobody knew it was there. And after the war was over and they were starting to renovate the building, the streets to bring back the Nuremberg, all of that stained glass and those statues came out and could be reinserted and reinstalled. So the second thing that Nuremberg decided is that they keep the basic layout of the city, the narrow winding streets, the parks, and everything would remain intact and would be brought back to the way it originally was. The third, to the extent possible, they would build new buildings, but they wouldn't build new buildings to look like new buildings. They would build new buildings that evoked the past. They were not replicas of the past. They were clearly new buildings, but they evoked the past because they occupied the same footprint as their predecessor, and they had the same window alignments and the same yellow facades and the same front to back pitched roofs. So you can really think you're in a medieval town as you walk the streets of parts of Nuremberg, and really be in a city that was built in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Because Nuremberg decided it would reject replicas. They rejected a sanitized version of the past. They called it Disneyfication. Instead of the comforts of nostalgia, Nuremberg would reach for authenticity. So that was the basic plan of what they decided to do. But there was one major problem, and it was a pretty big problem: what to do with the rally grounds. 4.5 square miles of property inside the city boundaries of Nuremberg, because the urban city is much larger than its historic core, like in Philadelphia, right? There's a lot of city beyond Society Hill. So what are they going to do with the rally grounds? Well, the city ignored it for 30 years, which is remarkable when you see how big it is, until they used it occasionally to park city vehicles. There were road rallies and so on, but that basically nobody paid attention to it. Just like they didn't pay attention to a lot of their Nazi past, until a group of young historians and preservation activists fought back, starting in 1968. A lot of them were college and university students. They argued that the rally grounds needed to be preserved as a warning from the past. And so they installed exhibits in Speer's deteriorating Nazi monuments, and they fought against a real estate developer who wanted to turn part of the rally grounds into a shopping mall. And they finally won. In 1990s, the city opened what they call the Documentation Center, the little glass box you see on this big building. It's not so little, it's just the building is mammoth. And in it is the very first exhibit in German history on the Holocaust, on the Nazi era. And it's just striking to see it on the rally grounds. It's a fabulous center. They call it the Documentation Center instead of a museum because they don't want to glorify the Nazi past. Now, every school child, every policeman, and every soldier must visit the Documentation Center as part of their orientation. It's built into a building called Congress Hall, which is a neo-Colosseum where the Nazis held its party meeting, and it was never finished because of its scale. Last year, the government of Germany decided to help the city of Nuremberg conserve actually, some of these Nazi architecture. So they have decided to put in a considerable amount of money on conservation to stabilize some of these buildings. This again is the Zeppelin Tribunal, so you can see what it looked like in the 1930s and what it looks like today. The city had basically blew up the colonnades and the other parts because they were unsafe and deteriorating. But you can still go and visit this area now. The problem with preserving these Nazi buildings, this Nazi architecture, is that the cost even of stabilizing them is so vast, and the dollars and euros to preserve them are so relatively small. So for years in the future, this is going to be part of the discussion. And we're back to the medieval core. So is this real? Is this fake? Who cares? Well, this part of Nuremberg, right in the middle of the old city, shows the debate that's going on now between a group of business people and wealthy local, good-hearted local folks called themselves the Friends of Old Nuremberg, and the die-hard preservationists. The Friends of Old Nuremberg, they want to build back the medieval city, and the hardcore preservationists want to keep to the original plan. And so here's what you see. You see a mix of things. Up on the left, you see you see a turret from the wall that surrounded the city, that part of which remained and part of which had to be reconstructed. Below it, you see new buildings from the 50s and how plain the fronts are. And then over on the right, you see a building that looks from the medieval period that might or might not be. And you really can't tell unless you know what you're looking at. So some of this is Disneyfication, and it's a matter of living debate there, but things get even more complicated. And here's another example. This is the Peller House. You see behind this beautiful statue in front of it on the building on the right. It's one of the few Baroque mansions that survived the war. But it didn't survive the war. Only a tiny bit of it did, which was a courtyard in the middle and some stairs and part of the facade. And because it was in such terrible shape, after the war, the city of Nuremberg built a building adjacent to it to sort of stabilize it. To the right, you see it. And that is a city building. It was used as the archives for quite a while. And if you look at the building on the left, you see part of the Peller House's interior, which is all faux. It's all new, built by the Friends of Old Nuremberg with 4.5 million euro. And behind it, you see a building from the 1950s, which is the extension of the building you see from the right. So it's actually built into the back of the Peller House. Well, of course, the Friends of Old Nuremberg, and of course the tourist industry, which is very big there, wants the 1950s building removed. The preservationists say you can't do that. The 1950s is an important period in Nuremberg history. And so by removing the 1950s portion of this Baroque house, you're basically lying through architecture. Where do you stand? We'll talk about that later. At the same time this debate is going on, the city is moving forward with its own branding. Because Nuremberg was the site of the Nuremberg trials, which established the principle of human rights, Nuremberg decided it wanted to brand itself as the city of human rights. And it was honored as such by UNESCO in 1990. And by 1993, they were transforming the city into human rights by starting with this grand sculpture, 13 pillars engraved with the United Nations Articles of Human Rights. There are 13 human rights, and those are written on the pillars in German and all the other languages of the earth. And the city government even has an office, an official office, Department of Human Rights, that promotes conferences, develops curricula, even film festivals. When I was visiting Nuremberg a couple years ago to do this chapter, there was a film festival, a human rights film festival going on. So we get back to the question at the heart of my book. What's real? What's fake? Why do we care? In Nuremberg, these are real issues. Historic preservation is of central importance. It's not a luxury. It is the debate around their self-identity. It affects the economy because they're heavily invested in tourism, but it's much more than that. It's a litmus test for values. For the city's fractured past does live on. And so when I left Nuremberg and thought about it for a while, I realized I learned a lot there. I learned that things, when you're talking about historic preservation, lay well beyond the simple dichotomy of real and fake, replica and reconstruction, and into what these concepts really mean in people's lives and why they matter. This city is the heart of Germanness, which was a vision so powerful that it transcended centuries. It's the majestic city of the Holy Roman Empire. It's Ludwig's dream. It's Hitler's dream of the Third Reich. It's the city of human rights. Nuremberg is all of those. And it struggles. It struggles to serve the tourists and also to preserve its own sense of integrity. It struggles to balance the myth of authentic Germanism and the country's actual painful past. Nuremberg is a living, vital city, and its citizens, like citizens of Philadelphia and also citizens of Springfield Township, you who care a lot about historic preservation, continue to argue over what kind of community you want to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. If attendees have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll pass those on to Nancy. But in the meantime, I had a question about the tribunal. I read recently that the decision is being made, as you say, to preserve it. But within the definition of preservation, there's conservation and there's restoration. And my understanding is that the city has decided to conserve it, but not restore it. And conservation is just to conserve. For those that don't know, conservation is the conservation of original materials. It's not restoring it to a particular place in time, which would be the time of the Nazis and their use of the site. So conservation in most cases is probably less expensive than restoration. But beyond that, I know that many municipalities here in the States are struggling with how to spend precious resources. And when it comes to controversial monuments, for instance, they are making the decision to not spend precious resources on maintaining these objects. For instance, if they've been graffitied, in some cases they're leaving the graffiti on because that now becomes part of the history of the monument. So I guess my question is, I guess I'm asking your thoughts on the difference between conserving the Zeppelin Tribunal and restoring it. My sense is that there's no need to restore it. I mean, that glorifies it in my mind, but it is an important historical site. So conservation, I think, is important, but to me, restoration goes to the point of glorification. And I just wanted to ask you your opinion on that.
Well, I think that for something like the Zeppelin Tribunal, it would be like outrageous to put that, that you could find the funds to recreate something this mammoth. But I think you raised, and so conservation is the answer here, but you raised a really interesting parallel to the monuments that have been removed, the Confederate monuments and so on. There's some in Pennsylvania, so I've had to deal with some of those issues too. And I think that with some of this, you really have to take a longer view, meaning that you don't want, on the one hand, you don't want to glorify history, but you can't ignore history. And so coming up with a solution for those monuments, just like they had to do in Germany, is not an easy, it's not an easy choice to make, and it's not a black and white decision. And I always think that when you're confronted with issues around, you know, monuments and of terrible, terrible acts, that you really have to sort of take a longer view and think that what you feel, what your impression is and how you will deal with it in this moment right now might be different than how than our grandchildren will feel about it in the future. So you have to save it all. That doesn't mean that you have to put it on display.
Okay, all right, thank you. So we have a question from Dave. What has modern chemical and other forms of testing revealed about the Proto-Hebraic scrolls?
Oh, what an interesting question. Thank you so much for that one, because it came up recently. As it turns out, there are many Dead Sea Scrolls. The people who lived in the caves near the Dead Sea lived there for many years and did a lot of writing. And so there are a lot of scrolls, and there's only tiny little scraps left. And some ended up in a museum in Washington, D.C. called the Museum of the Bible, which opened about 5 years ago. And it was funded by evangelicals, and they were very excited to have found scraps of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they put on display. And they were very excited about it, and their scholars thought it was terrific until somebody started looking at the chemistry, right? Just your question. Because you can test for some things. You can test the age of the paper. You can test the age of the ink. And you can tell through that how old they are. You can't tell whether the scribes in the caves wrote the Proto-Hebraic writing on the ancient parchment, but you can tell that they were done at a certain period of time using chemical analysis. So we don't know about Moses Shapiro's because they were destroyed in a fire, but you can tell the authenticity of other scraps of Dead Sea Scrolls.
So do they does the chemical analysis indicate a date for these scrolls? Does it confirm their authenticity?
The ones at the Museum of the Bible are fakes.
They're fakes.
They're fakes. And the Museum of the Bible admitted it, and now have them on exhibit as an example of how evil people are trying to dupe the public.
Okay. So I had another question about the way of human rights that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. The 13 columns. I think you referred to it as the Bill of Rights.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's not the Bill of Rights.
Well, I may be mistaken. What are the 13 rights? Is that a document or a?
Yeah, it's a United Nations, a UNESCO document.
UNESCO document. Okay.
Yeah, it documents the kinds of human rights that the world endorses.
Okay, it's not our U.S. Bill of Rights.
No, it isn't.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I guess what I'll do is thank you again for being with us this evening, and thank you to our attendees. We will this program has been recorded, so after we conclude this evening and take a look at that, we'll probably do some minor edits and post that on our YouTube channel, and with a link on our Historical Society's website, springfieldhistory.org. So once again, thank you everybody for coming this evening, and have a terrific rest of the evening. Thank you, Nancy.
My pleasure.